My name is Chloe. I'm 32. And I built everything I have from scratch. I didn't grow up with connections or silver spoons. My mom worked nights at a diner and taught me more about grit than any Ivy League ever could. Now, I'm a restaurant brand strategist in New York. I help struggling chefs and owners rediscover what makes their place special and turn it into something people wait months to get into. It's not flashy work, but it's smart and honest, and it changed my life. I married Nate 5 years ago. He's kind, brilliant, and carries the last name Walker, which in his world means legacy, real estate, and social clout. I never thought that would matter much until the night I walked into his parents' anniversary dinner and realized every seat at the table was already full. That night was supposed to be simple. Celebrate a long marriage. Raise a toast. Smile through small talk. But from the moment I stepped inside the restaurant and saw the expression on my mother-in-law's face, I knew this wasn't just about dinner. It was about position, about belonging, and about her making sure I knew exactly where I didn't fit. I remember standing there, every eye on me, heart pounding in my ears. My place wasn't just missing. It had been given away without a second thought. That moment, that cold calculation, would have crushed me once. But not anymore. Because what Valerie Walker didn't know that night was that the very restaurant she chose to flaunt her status was one I had helped rescue from failure. And soon enough, she'd find that out in the most unexpected way. I met Nate during our sophomore year at NYU. We were both in a marketing strategy class, and we got paired up for a semester-long project. At the time, I was balancing 3 part-time jobs just to cover what my scholarship didn't. And he showed up in a tailored coat driving a car I wouldn't dare park on my street. At first, I assumed he was another rich kid coasting on connections. But the more time we spent together, the clearer it became that he wasn't just generous with his words. He helped struggling classmates prep for exams, volunteered at a shelter on weekends, and never once made me feel like I was less than him. We built something slowly. Long nights working on case studies turned into long conversations about everything we hoped to do with our lives. I told him about my dream to help small, family-run restaurants stand a chance in a world of chains and franchises. And he told me he didn't want to be just another cog in his father's investment empire. I didn't meet his family until almost a year later. He'd mentioned them in vague ways. Big house in Connecticut. Summers in the Cape. His mom loved to host. I didn't think much of it until we pulled up to their estate and I realized their version of hosting involved a private chef and a valet service for a birthday brunch. The moment we walked in, Valeria Walker greeted Nate like royalty. Then she turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said my name, like it tasted unusual in her mouth. She scanned me head to toe before asking where I was from. And when I said Queens, she paused, like she was waiting for a punchline. She asked what my parents did. I told her my mom was a server and managed a local diner. Valerie nodded slowly and said it must have been a good lesson in humility. That was the first time I realized how much value she placed on pedigree. The brunch was long. The food was impeccable. And every conversation at the table felt like a coded test I didn't know I was taking. Which clubs did I belong to? None. Unless you counted the library. Did I know the Whitmans from Greenwich? I didn't. But apparently I should have. I laughed when I didn't know what else to do. Nate squeezed my hand under the table, completely missing the way his mother was curating every moment to remind me I didn't belong. Her comments weren't cruel in tone, but they landed like darts. Light enough to brush off, sharp enough to sting. When we left that day, Nate said his mom was just particular, that she was like that with everyone. But I'd seen the way she welcomed others, how she leaned in warmly when speaking to family friends, and offered second helpings to the women married into other powerful families. With me, there was a wall, smooth, polite, ice cold. It wasn't just about money. It was about what money signaled. Background, upbringing, the right kind of success. I was never going to check her boxes. no matter how hard I worked or how kind I was. Still, I kept showing up. For Nate. For us. And because I wanted to believe that if I proved myself enough, she'd eventually see me as more than just a girl from the wrong zip code. But deep down, I was already learning. With people like Valerie, acceptance isn't something you earn. It's something they decide to grant. Or not. Over the years, Valerie never outright insulted me. It was always in the tone, the timing, the way her compliments curled just enough to sting. Like how she'd gush about someone else's daughter in law's law degree, then turn to me and say how admirable it was that I'd made something of myself without one. At first, I told myself I was being too sensitive. That maybe I just wasn't used to their kind of language. But there's a difference between unfamiliarity and being quietly pushed aside in every conversation that matters. She never forgot to send holiday cards to Nate's sister and her family. But I'd get a generic email, sometimes with the wrong spelling of my name. If Nate noticed, he never said. If I pointed it out, he'd shrug and say, she probably got busy or confused. It became easier to stay quiet than explain how it felt. The bigger my career got, the quieter she became around me. When I started consulting, I worked with hole-in-the-wall spots that reminded me of my mom's old diner. I didn't have a degree from Stanford, but I knew how to fix a broken dining room flow, how to balance costs without killing soul, how to turn a space into a story. Within 5 years, I had clients from coast to coast and a team of junior consultants working under me. I was proud. Nate was too. In his way, he'd brag to friends about my work ethic, about how I built everything without a family safety net. But with his parents, especially Valerie, that pride became silence. He didn't know how to talk about me in their world. Or maybe he didn't want to rock the boat. There was the baby shower I wasn't invited to. A mix-up, Valerie said. Then the fundraiser dinner where she introduced me as Nate's friend. Not his wife. Another slip, she claimed, her smile sharp. And the time she offered me a contact at a restaurant chain she assumed I'd never be able to reach on my own. I spent years collecting moments like that, small enough to dismiss individually, heavy as stone when carried together. Sometimes, Nate tried. He'd step in when things got too blatant. He once called her out for interrupting me every time I spoke. She laughed and said it was just habit. No harm meant. He let it go after that. He wanted to believe the best of her. I used to want that too. But intentions don't erase patterns. And my presence in her world was always met with resistance. Not because I was unkind, not because I didn't try, but because I reminded her of everything she thought she'd left behind. Still, I kept showing up. To dinners, to family weekends, to birthday parties where I brought a dish and she'd smile like she was surprised it was actually good. Every time I succeeded, she moved the goalposts. I remember the year I got nominated for a National Restaurant Award. Nate's dad sent flowers. Valerie sent a text that said, "Impressive for someone without formal culinary training." I laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny, but because by then, I had learned to expect it. The gap between us widened slowly. Not loud, not messy, just a steady drift that Nate didn't always see. I didn't want to force him to choose. But part of me wondered if I'd ever fully belonged to a family that only valued the kind of success they could understand. I didn't need her approval to define me. But over time, the rejection added up. Not in a dramatic way. More like a low hum in the background of every celebration. Every gathering. Every moment that should have felt like home. And through it all, I stayed quiet longer than I should have. Because I believed that if I just kept proving my worth, eventually someone like Valerie would have no choice but to see it. I didn't know yet that recognition from people like her doesn't come from how hard you work. It comes when your value forces its way into the room so loudly, even they can't ignore it. The brass doors of Astrid glided open, and a hush of velvet and candlelight greeted me. Crystal chandeliers floated above tables dressed in linen so fine it looked poured rather than placed. A cello hummed in the corner, each note polished like glass. The maitre d' recognized the Walker name and guided me across a parquet floor that glowed like honey. My heels clicked in measured beats. A drum behind the symphony of murmured conversations and silver against china. I rehearsed a smile I hoped would shield me from whatever small test Valerie had planned. Through the soft haze of votive flames, I saw the family gathered at a window table that framed the skyline like a living painting. 10 chairs circled, white china trimmed in gold. 10 posture-perfect bodies angled toward one empty place I assumed was mine. When I reached the last stride, I realized every seat was already filled. For an instant my mind refused to parse the tableau. Then I found myself counting again, tracing the curve of each high-back chair until the number refused to change. The shock felt physical. A punch delivered in silence. Harold noticed me first and half rose, confusion tugging at his kind features. Valerie touched his wrist with manicured calm and guided him back down as if smoothing a wrinkle in the evening. Her eyes settled on me like frost on glass. She offered a smile so controlled, it barely moved her face and greeted me with polite surprise. Her voice carried just enough volume for nearby tables to hear that the arrangement was family only tonight, and how unfortunate it was that Nate's business trip kept him away. She added that the guest list had been finalized weeks ago. Surely I understood. The cello kept playing, yet the notes felt thinner, stretched over the quiet now circling us. A waiter appeared behind me holding a gleaming extra chair, hope on his face. But Valerie lifted one palm with an apology about fire safety regulations and narrow aisles. She suggested a charming bistro down the street. Something more intimate and perhaps more comfortable. Heat climbed my neck, but my feet refused to retreat. The air smelled of truffle and citrus. And still, I caught the faint guilt of diners pretending not to watch. Each second lengthened until it felt like I stood in amber. I thought of Nate in Chicago believing kindness could buffer cruelty. I thought of the hours spent choosing a dress that would pass unnoticed in rooms like this. My heart thudded hard enough to rock my balance. Yet my voice stayed tucked behind clenched teeth. Turning, I faced the maitre d' who lingered close enough to witness. My lips curved into something that could be mistaken for calm while inside, a small part of me cracked. I told myself that the woman who once scraped bus fare from tip jars would not crumble over one missing chair. Valerie resumed her conversation as if nothing had happened, lifting a crystal flute to her lips. The others followed her lead. Relief and discomfort, flickering across their faces, like candle shadows. I tasted salt at the edge of my tongue and realized it was my own restraint. Walking away would be easy. A taxi could swallow me, and the city would blur the humiliation into lights. Yet I stayed rooted, sensing a boundary drawn in that moment between who I had been and who I had become. I inhaled until the scent of lilies from the centerpiece mingled with the copper of adrenaline. My reflection wavered in a nearby mirror, and for the first time I saw more steel than softness in my posture. The next move, I knew. It would decide whether this story ended in quiet defeat or something entirely different. I turned back to the maitre d' and asked, in a tone that surprised even me, if Chef Adrian might spare a moment. The words left my mouth smooth as silk, yet carried the weight of every slight I had swallowed. As he hurried toward the kitchen, a hush rippled through the dining room, and I felt eyes following, but not one belonged to me anymore. Valerie glanced over, puzzled by my composure, perhaps expecting tears or retreat. Instead, she watched me straighten my shoulders and rest one hand lightly on the velvet rope that separated ordinary diners from the best seats in the house. I chose in that heartbeat not to leave, not to shrink, and certainly not to let a missing chair decide my worth. The maitre d' returned quickly, his steps brisk, and his expression changed. He didn't stop at the podium or glance toward the front. Instead, he walked straight to me, nodded once, and said the chef would be right out. The quiet curiosity around us deepened. Diners now fully invested in something they couldn't name, but sensed was about to unfold. The doors to the kitchen swung open, and there he was, Chef Adrian himself, tall in his pressed white coat, salt and pepper hair pulled back, and a broad smile spreading across his face as soon as he saw me. In a room built on performance, his joy was the first real thing I had felt all night. He crossed the floor in long strides and embraced me without hesitation. The embrace wasn't awkward or formal. It was warm, familiar, the kind reserved for someone who had stood beside you when everything was falling apart. He pulled back and asked why I hadn't told him I'd be here. I laughed softly, said it was supposed to be a quiet evening. The corners of his mouth lifted like he knew better. I gestured discreetly toward the Walker table and said there had been a mix-up with the seating. Chef Adrian's Gaza followed my gesture. He didn't need more details. His face shifted from warmth to quiet understanding. Then he turned to the maitre d' and asked for table 12. Every head at the Walker table tilted slightly in our direction. Valerie narrowed her eyes. Harold sat frozen, a napkin clutched loosely in one hand. The rest of the table had gone still, holding champagne flutes, mid-air and waiting. Table 12. The chef's table. The best seat in the house. La Saville for food critics, dignitaries, and the kind of people who had entire magazine spreads written about them. I had helped design that experience. I never imagined I'd be the one invited to sit there. Chef Adrian turned back to me and said it as clear as day. Nothing but the best for the woman who saved Astrid. His voice wasn't loud, but the room had quieted enough to let every word land like a drumbeat. He took my arm and guided me across the dining room. Servers moved quickly, resetting the chef's table with clean linens, polished glasses, and a new set of menus. A small card bearing my name was placed gently beside the wine list, and a single orchid rested in a glass vase at the center. Details I had once coached them to include for special guests. I caught a glimpse of Valerie's face as we passed. Her expression flickered between disbelief and something close to panic. It was the look of someone watching a script unravel mid-performance. Adrian pulled out my chair and told me he was sending out a tasting menu. Custom dishes. Off the menu. Wines I had personally helped them choose. As he returned to the kitchen, he said he would come back to check on me later. The maitre d' poured the first glass of wine, a rare vintage I had recommended 6 months earlier. From where I sat, I could see the entire restaurant, including the Walkers. Valerie stared across the room like she was trying to rework the narrative in her head. The woman she had written off was being treated like royalty in a space she had chosen to establish dominance. A few minutes later, Harold stood and made his way toward me. He looked uncomfortable, but curious. He asked how I knew the chef. I told him I had consulted for Astrid last year during their rebranding and operational overhaul. I had been part of the team that redesigned everything from the menu to the lighting to the guest experience. I had done it quietly, without telling anyone, because it was just work. Just one of many clients. Harold blinked and said he had no idea. He said Valerie talked for weeks about how hard it was to get a reservation, that she'd called in favors from the city's elite. I said nothing. There was nothing to add. Then he asked if I wanted to join them back at the table. I smiled and said thank you. But the chef had made other arrangements. I told him to enjoy the evening. He hesitated, then nodded, and returned to the others. As the first course arrived, a delicate scallop crudo, layered with herbs and citrus foam. A handwritten note came with it. It said, "For the woman who reminded us that story is just as important as skill." I felt my throat tighten. Rachel, Nate's sister, crossed the room next. She looked unsure, almost guilty. She said she didn't know Valerie had uninvited me. If she had known, she would have said something. I said it was okay. We both knew it wasn't. But I appreciated the effort. Back at their table, the conversation had shifted. People whispered, glanced in my direction, and tried to make sense of it all. Valerie remained quiet, her posture rigid. She didn't lift her wine glass again. By the time the main course arrived, a slow-roasted duck with blackberry reduction, The entire staff treated me with a reverence that wasn't performative. They weren't doing it because I was connected. They were doing it because I had helped them survive when no one else could. And Valerie knew it. Dessert came in the form of a chocolate sculpture that shimmered under gold dust, filled with layers of mousse and fruit. Not a menu item. A gift. As the plate was set down, the server said, "Compliments of Chef Adrian. In appreciation for everything you gave us." It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even triumph. It was truth, quietly presented in course after course, detail after detail, until even Valerie couldn't ignore it. I didn't have to say a word. The room had already spoken. And this time, I was exactly where I belonged. I sat at the chef's table, not as a guest of the family, but as someone the restaurant itself honored. Each dish came out like a quiet thank you. Every detail, every gesture, reminded me that I had earned this space, not through invitation, but through work no one had seen until now. Across the room, the Walker table had grown quieter. Conversations thinned, replaced by sideways glances and unfinished bites. Valerie sat motionless, her smile frozen at the corners, as if holding it in place would stop the moment from slipping further out of her control. I could feel the shift happening without anyone needing to name it. The woman they thought didn't belong was being served a custom tasting menu by one of the city's most sought-after chefs. Not because of who I married. Because of who I was. Rachel kept looking over, then back at Valerie, like she wasn't sure where to land. Colin sat stiffly beside her, sipping his drink too fast. The Andersons, who had taken the seat that was supposed to be mine, avoided eye contact entirely. When the maitre d' brought out the third course, a wine pairing I had once helped select during a sourcing review, I caught Valerie staring. She wasn't angry. Not yet. Just confused. Like the math no longer worked in her head. I wasn't the poor girl from Queens anymore. I was something she didn't have a category for. Chef Adrian returned between courses, casual as ever, checking on the flavors and laughing with the servers. It wasn't a performance. It was familiarity, comfort, the kind that can't be faked or forced. The diners at nearby tables watched closely now. Not with pity but curiosity. The narrative had flipped. They didn't see someone excluded anymore. They saw someone important. Someone who had walked in as a shadow, and now lit the center of the room. At the Walker table, Valerie leaned toward Harold and whispered something sharp. He didn't respond. Instead, he watched me carefully, studying me with a new kind of attention. Maybe for the first time, he saw me not through her filters, but his own. When the server set down a dish inspired by my grandmother's holiday recipe, a warm plate I had once described to Adrian in passing, I felt something in my chest tighten. Not from hurt. From being seen? Valerie rose from the table. She moved with purpose, high heels snapping against the marble, and came straight to me. Every conversation around us dimmed, as if the room itself paused to listen. She asked what I had done, whether I had pulled strings, used Nate's name to stage all of this. Her words were low but sharp, aimed more to wound than to understand. I looked up slowly and set down my fork. Then I asked if she wanted to join me. My tone was calm, level, and without heat. The way you speak when the power has already shifted and you have nothing left to prove. She accused me of staging a spectacle. I reminded her that Harold had invited me weeks ago, that Nate had asked me to attend, even without him, that I had no idea I'd been removed from the reservation. The silence that followed wasn't mine to fill. Chef Adrian returned again, catching the tension in the air. He greeted Valerie with professional courtesy and introduced himself as the restaurant's owner. He said I had transformed Astrid during a period when it was on the verge of closing. He credited me with everything from staff retraining to the cocktail she held in her hand. Each word landed like a stone dropped in water. Clear. Measured. Irrefutable. I could see it happening in real time. The recalculation? The attempt to hold on to the old version of the story and watching it dissolve in front of her? Harold stood from his seat again and approached. This time, there was something different in his posture. He didn't try to soften the moment or explain it away. He just said he hadn't known. That it changed things. Behind him, the others at the table had grown quiet. Their conversations replaced by the uncomfortable realization that something they thought they understood had never really been true. Valerie's expression held no warmth now. Only the discomfort of being the one exposed. She said maybe I had more to offer than she realized. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest she had ever come. I nodded. Because that moment wasn't for her. It was for me. I looked around the restaurant. At the light bouncing off the wine glasses. At the team I had once worked beside. At the guests who now watched me, not with doubt but with interest. This wasn't about revenge. This was about return. The kind you only get after losing something quietly for too long. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for permission to belong. I was already there. Sitting at a table meant for others. Being served meals that had my fingerprints on their creation. And holding space that no one could take from me. Valerie turned and walked back to her seat. Slower this time. I picked up my glass and took a long, quiet sip. The bitterness I expected never came. Only clarity. Only peace. 2 days after the dinner, Valerie invited us to the house. It came through Harold. Not her. And the wording was careful. She wanted to speak with both of us. And there was something in his voice that made it clear this wasn't just about smoothing things over. The house looked the same. Perfectly arranged. Every detail just as pristine as it had always been. But when Valerie opened the door herself, not the housekeeper, I noticed her posture was different. She looked smaller somehow. Like something had been knocked loose in her. We sat in the formal sitting room. And no one reached for drinks. She folded her hands in her lap. Took a breath. And looked at Nate first. Her voice was even. But there was no polish in it this time. She said she owed us both an apology. And she didn't mean just for the dinner. She said she had spent years pushing me away. That she saw herself doing it, and still couldn't stop. Nate shifted beside me. Waiting for an explanation. Valerie looked at me then. Really looked. And said that when she met me, something in her recoiled. She said it wasn't because I wasn't smart or kind or accomplished. It was because I reminded her of a version of herself she had buried so deep, she'd almost forgotten it existed. She grew up in a tiny town in Pennsylvania. Her father cleaned offices. Her mother packed lunches for other people's kids. They had nothing. But she carried herself like they did. She got into college on a scholarship. Worked nights waitressing. And married Harold, while he was still in law school. From that moment on, she said, she made a choice. She changed her voice. Her wardrobe. Her friends. She told herself the past didn't matter as long as no one ever saw it. When Nate brought me home, she said it was like seeing a ghost. A reminder of who she used to be. One she had spent her whole adult life trying to forget. She didn't hate me. She feared what I meant. That the world she'd built might not be as solid as she thought. I sat there quietly. Listening. Unsure what to feel. Part of me wanted to rage. To ask why she'd taken her shame and turned it into my punishment. But another part saw the woman in front of me. Stripped of all armor. Admitting that her cruelty wasn't about class or pride. It was about survival. Nate's voice broke the silence. He said he wished she had told him sooner. She nodded and said she was ashamed. That she thought she could control it. But she couldn't. Then she turned to me again. She said I didn't need her approval. And she knew that now. But she hoped I would let her try to change. Not to erase the past. Just to show up better for the future. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just told her the truth. That I wasn't angry anymore. But I wasn't ready to pretend nothing happened. That healing isn't a performance. And trust doesn't return just because someone asks for it. She nodded again. Slower this time. and said she understood. As we left the house, Nate took my hand, and we walked down the stone path in silence. The wind was light, the sky pale and clear. I realized I didn't feel weight in my chest anymore. What she had done still hurt. But now I knew where it came from, and that changed everything. It didn't change overnight. There were no dramatic declarations or sweeping gestures. But something in Valerie began to soften. And for the first time, I could feel it. A week after our talk, she forwarded me an article about a restaurant opening in Soho. She added a short note saying it reminded her of the kind of places I worked with. It wasn't a compliment exactly, but it wasn't cold either. A few days later, she called to ask for a vinaigrette recipe I had mentioned during a family brunch. I gave it to her, half expecting it to be a one-off moment. But 2 weeks after that, she sent me a photo of the salad she made with it and asked if she'd overdone the mustard. It felt small, but it also felt real. She didn't hide behind formalities or pass it through Harold. She reached out like a person trying, even if she didn't know how to say it out loud. We weren't close. Not yet. But something had shifted between us. The tension that used to fill every silence had loosened its grip. Now it was something else. Uneasy but open. Like standing at the edge of new ground. One Saturday afternoon, she stopped by with a bundle of herbs from her garden. Said she thought I might be able to use them in a new dish. I invited her in and offered her coffee. And to my surprise, she said yes. She sat at the edge of a kitchen stool, hands folded, watching as I prepped a marinade. Her posture was careful, but her eyes kept scanning the space. I could tell she was paying attention. Not just to the kitchen, but to me, to how I moved, to what I created. She asked about the countertop stone, then the spice rack, and eventually, almost shyly, if I might be willing to teach her how to roast vegetables the way I did. I said sure. The answer came out easy. Without hesitation. We didn't talk about what happened. Not that day. Not for a long while. But I noticed that she stopped calling me Nate's wife in conversations with others. She started using my name. And sometimes, when she introduced me to someone new, she mentioned my work without sounding like she was trying to prove something. There were still moments when the old habits showed a certain tone, a long pause before giving praise. But they didn't land the same way anymore. Not since I understood what lived behind them. I never told anyone about her past. Not even Nate. It wasn't my story to share. And somehow, keeping that secret made me feel stronger. Not smaller. Like I was holding a truth that let me see her as a full person. Not just a version of who she tried to be. One afternoon, she sat in my kitchen as I plated a tasting spread for a new client. She watched quietly for a long time. Then said she used to love cooking before she forgot how to enjoy it. I didn't say anything at first. Then I asked if she wanted to help next time. Her eyes flicked up, surprised, and she gave a small nod. It wasn't a big moment. No swelling music or tearful breakthrough. Just two women in a kitchen, learning how to make space for each other. And for the first time, it felt like something new was possible. Not perfect, but real. And that was enough. Our housewarming party was small but filled with warmth. We had just finished renovating the kitchen, turning it into a space where I could experiment and host friends. Guests mingled in the backyard, laughter floating over the soft glow of string lights. Valerie sat beside my Aunt Susan, who had turned my late grandmother's diner into a successful farm-to-table spot. They talked quietly about seasonal vegetables and recipe swaps. A conversation I never imagined I'd hear them have. I watched Valerie lean in. Her guarded demeanor softened as she asked about the best way to prepare fresh herbs. Inside, my niece Sue pulled me aside. Nervous but eager. She wanted advice on which hospitality internship would give her the best experience. We talked through the options, weighing what each place could teach her about restaurant development. Valerie glanced through the window, catching our eye, and offered a small nod, a silent approval that felt like a quiet bridge between us. Later, as guests began to leave, Nate wrapped his arms around me and whispered how much better this night felt compared to past family gatherings. We talked about what kind of parents and in-laws we wanted to be, ones who respected boundaries, supported choices, and fostered kindness even when traditions challenged us. I thought about the journey with Valerie from exclusion to tentative respect to this fragile harmony. I promised myself that if I ever became a mother-in-law, I would remember what it felt like to be on the outside looking in, to choose empathy over judgment and connection over control. The night ended quietly, the scent of rosemary lingering in the air, and a sense of hope weaving through the conversations, still buzzing softly. This was more than a housewarming. It was a new beginning. Have you ever been in a room where you felt invisible or judged, without a word being said? Maybe you've been misunderstood or excluded by people who should have been your closest allies. I want you to think about those moments and what they taught you about your own strength. It's hard to stand your ground when the world tries to define your worth for you. But speaking your truth, even when it feels risky, is one of the most powerful things you can do. You don't need anyone else's permission to be proud of who you are and what you've accomplished. If you face similar challenges or found your voice in the face of doubt, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below so we can build a community of support and understanding. Remember, sometimes the most important thing is refusing to shrink yourself to make others comfortable.